What's up, guys? It's the Brian Moote Show. Hit us up on the studio burner, 310-429-8903. I want to make you guys who listen part of the show. That's something I'm going to do on this show and every show I do moving forward, no matter what city that's in. I want to make the people who listen part of the content. So leave us a voicemail, say something funny about the show. The more, the better. I want to have a rotating batch of just people saying funny stuff. And that's because, we're nothing without people listening. And I appreciate that. All right, we're starting something new. I am live in Chicago right now. I'm at Morning Show Boot Camp. And gotta be honest, I'm not a big fan of these types of conventions. I just want to make people laugh, have a good time. I don't like the nuts and bolts. I don't like awkward conversations. And I'm in a little bit of a gray area right now in terms of where I will land with a radio show eventually. So those conversations, way more awkward now. I don't want to tell people what happened. I don't like people feeling bad for me. I just want to make people laugh. So what we're going to do, Flashback Friday. Every Friday, I'm going to intro an episode of the show. I've been doing podcasts with my brother, Patrick, and various people for damn near 4 years now. And we have some that are really good. Really good. And I want to introduce people to those things. So every Friday, we're going to do a little bit of a throwback. And today, no better way to kick this whole thing off than one of the most popular podcast episodes I've ever had. It was on the Moot Points podcast 3 years ago in Atlanta. And it was me interviewing my father about going to prison. And my father and I hadn't talked about prison since he got out. We really never talked about it. We never talked about what happened, what made him go in, his decision-making process. We never had healing. We did a therapy session with my former marriage counselor when I was married, who knew me very well. And then we went home and we taped a podcast. It's going to be a two-parter. So this Friday, you're going to get the first part. I know, that's annoying. And next Friday, you'll get the second part. But if you want to know who I am, where I came from, you want to know the story about my father going to prison, you want to know about how proud I am of him since he's been in prison, listen to this podcast. If you've already heard it before, it might be good for you now again, because I know a lot of you guys go through things with your family members, people you love, and you struggle with forgiveness, letting them back in your life. I think that this interview will maybe help in terms of, man, this person destroyed me. Where do we start over again? So this is the first Flashback Friday Brian Moote Show episode. It's me interviewing my father. It's called Former Inmate, Former Lawyer, Current Role Model. And welcome to the Moot Points podcast, hosted by myself, Brian Moote, and generally Patrick Moote, though he's been quite the diva, off gallivanting through Hollywood, auditioning for commercials and telling me he's going to come back and then not coming back. So I'm forced to add a plethora of co-hosts to the show. And today is a great one. Actually, Pat may lose his job. Today is my father, Peter Moote. So it's still a Moot Point podcast. Dad, how are you?
Fine, thank you, Brian.
And no, this is going to be a fun episode. It's been, in all transparency, it's been a cool day. My dad went with me to counseling today, to see my counselor, Mrs. Pat Jones, and I thought it was good. It was good for us communication. We talked about some things that we'll probably maybe talk about later, maybe not. For those of you who listen to the Burt Show, you know that my dad is out here working. He's got meetings with Gwinnett County, right, so far?
Yes.
And who else?
United Way, that works with Gwinnett County, and a couple of other organizations that help people who are reentering from prison. We've got some calls out. One's to the governor's office that made an inquiry earlier. I expect we'll be speaking with them this week. And other individuals that have loved ones that are in prison and aren't sure what to do to help them. And it turns out there's really a lot you can do, but people feel real frustrated because it doesn't seem like there's anything they can do. So I'll be looking forward to talking with them as well.
So right out the gates, if people want to get a hold of you, should they just email you right now? I know you're working on web stuff, and we're trying to get my dad into the 21st century with Twitter and things like that. So eventually, right now, if anyone who's listening either works with inmate reentry, recidivism, granted, we're going to talk about your experience, my experience. We'll tell some funny stories. It's not going to all be serious because I want to tell some of those funny stories that we have. Should people just email you?
Yeah, that's the best way. I check my email every day, and it's an easy email. It's the reverse of my name, mootepeter@gmail.com.
See, look at that. You're not super old. You have a Gmail account.
Yeah, well, you set it up for me.
Yeah, we ditched that AOL. That's how you know, by the way, that's how you know somebody's on the older end of the internet spectrum when they still rock that AOL account. But he does have a BlackBerry. Don't hold that against him. I think you're the only one holding on to the BlackBerry still. I know at this point it's like mostly iPhones, a few Droids, and then the one that bursts into flames in your pockets.
Yeah, I'm getting forced into getting a modern smartphone simply because the BlackBerry doesn't pick up apps and doesn't coordinate with much of anything else.
Well, why would people are going to waste their time with apps for a phone that 12 people in the country are using, and the only reason you're using it is because you have thumbs the size of my big toe.
That's true. That's the keypad that really has my attention with it. But I knew the time was coming when Facebook Messenger emailed me that they were discontinuing support of the BlackBerry.
Oh, they do? They died. You can't even message it?
Yeah, I can't. They won't. They just said, we're done.
When Zuckerberg bails on an investment, you know it's a bad investment.
Yeah, it's going down again. The BlackBerry's going down again.
So I don't want to jump just right into like prison stuff. Let's give people a little background on you. Born in Detroit, Michigan.
Correct.
But you grew up primarily most of your life in Tustin, California.
Yeah, my junior high and high school days, even early college days, were in Southern California.
Where he was a whale of a tennis player.
That's what I did. I played tennis every day from age 11 to 21.
Now, you know how I know you're good at tennis is because when you tried to put us in tennis classes, like those tennis camps when we were kids, I would I was already competitive, so I remember basketball. Well, we talked about this. You might have let me win the first time that I was ever good at basketball, but eventually I could get you. But it didn't shake my confidence. But I remember Patrick and I we're playing doubles tennis at the high school in the tennis camp, and then you came over and you just started smoking serves at us. That it's something that we can. Every time I tried to serve the ball, I'd hit it over the fence like a home run derby. So you still got the skills.
I do. The problem is I grew up in my day. It was still the wood racket.
The catgut strings.
The catgut strings, wood racket. I get a hold of one of those new modern metal or whatever they are, and the ball goes off like a rocket. I can't even control it anymore.
Well, I remember being absolutely horrified when you served the ball at us, and I decided I was forever going to play basketball. So you went to Redlands College, University of Redlands, where I actually played your alma mater in college, in my college, Laverne, and we smoked you fools way out in Inland Empire. And
that was basketball. We couldn't
have taken you in tennis.
We were national champions in tennis. NAIA, not NCAA.
So then after that, you moved to Seattle. I want you to tell everybody, so you met Mom in, 78?
1979.
79. Oh, yeah, 79 because of the Seattle Supersonics.
That's right.
Now, the Merchant Cafe was your first date.
Right.
First real date. Now, I wanted to tell
First
everybody,
time I ever saw her was at Merchant's Cafe.
And that's at Pioneer Square, right near, we're actually like just down the street from where you and I lived together in Seattle a few years ago.
Correct.
But you have a legendary pickup line to get Mom into the bar to hang out for your first date.
Oh, yeah.
I want you to tell everybody this with a straight face
man.
because I feel like on paper it's real cute, but I think if you're the woman who's a basketball fan on the receiving end of this, you're probably not a fan.
Yeah, well, I can't say it with a straight face, but it was the Seattle Supersonics were in the finals of the NBA basketball championship, and the game was in Seattle. At that time, it was at the Kingdom, which was just down the street from the Merchants Cafe. I was having a beer with Joanne's brother and a real close friend. She came by looking for her sisters because they had a ticket for her to the game and she couldn't find them. And as soon as she sat down, I was taken. But she was busy looking for her sisters, so she took off, came back a little later, still couldn't find her sisters, and it was going to be too late. So she was upset about that. So I told her I had an extra seat in the front row for the basketball game if she still wanted to go. It turns out I had a very good friend at the U District a few miles away that had a tavern with a great big TV screen, one of the originals. So I called him to save us a front row seat. And she went on a date with me, and I took her there.
Here's our front row seat. All you can drink.
They were front row seats.
Well, that makes me laugh. And then, okay, we moved to Whidbey Island. I know we're jumping. We're jumping forward quickly.
Well, she was even working on Whidbey Island at that time. She was.
She was the director of home health nursing. You opened you started in law. What was your background? When did you start in law? What area was it that you started in?
I actually started in legal services that provided legal assistance to people in poverty that needed help with civil matters like landlord issues, domestic issues, child custody issues, and welfare issues. And then I really wanted to be a public defender. I wanted to get into criminal law. So one of the colleagues that I had in school joined a public defender firm in Seattle, and they needed a lawyer. So he called me, and my first main litigation job was as a public defender in Seattle in 1977.
And then you moved. How long did you do that for? And then you moved. Did you move into employment and civil rights stuff from there, or was that later on?
I was at the public defender office for 3 years, and then that same friend that I went to law school with, and I started our own middle class, I'll call it middle class, blue collar law firm with street level offices. It'd be like what you consider storefront lawyering, where we opened some offices in communities and tried to charge lesser fees so people that were working would have better access to legal counsel. And so we started that firm. We started with 4 offices. It was Hain and Moote, and we were the first law firm in Washington to advertise on television. The Supreme Court had come out with a decision that said lawyers could advertise on television and radio in the media, whereas previous to that it was illegal or unethical to do so. So since that opening came about, we decided it would be perfect for our idea of opening some storefront offices to get the message out to more middle-class people that they could have better access to legal services. And our slogan was Hain and Moote, accessible, affordable, and feisty.
I think I had a shirt when I was a kid that said that on it.
You did, yeah.
Accessible, affordable, and feisty.
Right.
And so from there, you moved into employment law. When did you open the private practice on Whidbey Island, where I grew up, my hometown?
1983, so you would have been 2 years old at the time.
Don't date me. I'm in show business.
All right. Sorry, pal. I had an office on Whidbey Island and also kept the office in Seattle. And at that time, I was doing criminal law, workers' compensation, which is a branch of employment law, and started doing civil rights work, which involved people suffering discrimination, harassment, disability discrimination.
You had some really big civil rights cases. I know that I worked on one for racial discrimination. against Rabanco. We can say their name, right? Because you didn't get it sealed or anything, right? I didn't just violate some sort of NDA.
No, you're fine. It's a public record. Yes, that was on behalf of 15 minorities that were being discriminated against by internationally large waste management company.
And that's my first experience. I guess where this story ends up going is that in a couple of different ways. And, we end up with the work you're doing now. But when I helped you out on that case as an investigator and just, and going around getting documents, because you have 15 guys who some were at that point in time like depressed, disabled. They'd been wronged by this company. And that's the first time I got an experience for just how tedious, time-consuming, and expensive going up against corporations are for anything, whether it be sexual harassment or civil rights violations or discrimination. Just can you explain why that happens? And why are you at such a disadvantage when you're going up against a corporate entity like that?
Yeah, my practice actually evolved into almost all that type of work. It's called contingency work because your client generally doesn't have a job. They've been fired because of discrimination. They've been fired because of an injury that they're trying to recover from, and they're entitled to benefits. They're not being paid either under workers' compensation or insurance law. So my clients were always broke. They didn't have jobs. They were denied income. Often they had all kinds of problems that went along with that, like having trouble paying the mortgage, losing your house, getting evicted, cause problems with divorces and relationships when you're not able to work and you can't bring money home and maintain your standard of living. So it's a stressful time. It creates additional disabilities for people of mental health nature. And as a lawyer, you don't see any compensation for the work that you do until the very end when you settle or win a case. And it costs money to make a case work. The problem with taking on big corporations, insurance companies, government, is they have all the resources. So I'd usually be myself and whatever team of individuals I could put together. Like there were times when you did investigation work for
your
me.
college son who's home for the summertime.
Really?
Maybe not the greatest investigator, but still tries.
It was a body to get some work done, and I couldn't otherwise get done. And they would put 3 or 4 lawyers and a whole investigative group on their side, and I'd have to keep up with that and try and match it. They would hire experts to testify. I would have to hire experts to match those, and it often would involve huge investments in a case before you ever get paid back that money. Yeah.
And so that could, if you're not equipped for that infrastructure, it put you in a hole pretty quick. I remember that when we were working, we had a request for discovery, which for people to know, it's you're requesting all the documents. They have to give over all the documents that they're going to be used in the case that for investigative purposes. And they all came, all these human resources files for all these 15 plaintiffs came just mix-mashed, just some things Xeroxed upside down and backwards and put in because they just wanted to create more of a problem for the defense or for the plaintiffs.
Yeah, that was a tactic. And usually when that happened, you knew there was information in there. They were ordered to disclose it, so they weren't going to violate a court order, but they would package it in such a way that hopefully you wouldn't find it. Generally, that was a clue that there was some real damaging material in there that would win your case for you if you could find it.
Right, if you dig through enough.
Right, so I'd spend hours trying to resort that and categorize it, but usually you'd find the smoking gun in there.
Yeah. And we did on that one, and you settled that one for a pretty big number. I mean, all the plaintiffs were real happy, and with the verdict. Was it settled, or did it go to court?
It settled on the eve of going to court, so the case was totally prepared at the time. But it was a very good settlement, and some of the individuals went back to work. Others were able to retire on it, and it was well deserved. But the problem was, it took 4+ years to get there, and that was 4 years of those individuals being out of work. and having trouble certainly couldn't find anything comparable to it. And most of them had all kinds of disasters happen to them. If you can imagine having a standard of living that you developed over a period of a decade or two, and then all of a sudden discriminatorily losing your job, trying to replace that income is next to impossible. And when you can't replace it, the lifestyle that you'd built up starts to deteriorate. When you have a family that relies on that, their whole life changes. So, yeah, in the end, you could say that there was some justice that prevailed, but none of them could ever be put back in the position they were in if that hadn't happened. And it was just real blatant discrimination.
Oh, and the worst part is that they ultimately knew they were guilty the entire time, and they just dragged it out, and they tried to strong arm some guys into settling and some guys not. It was really nasty watching it happen because you saw the deliberate cost benefit analysis happening, where they had a number. Okay, we're going to spend this much money on defending it. We're going to try to do this. If we can't have this happen, then eventually they were going to settle the whole time. If you guys put together a strong enough case, they were always going to settle.
If you stayed in it, 90% of the cases wind up settling for what they call nuisance value, which is just very little money, because they can't afford to keep fighting with them. They can't afford to keep dragging it out. They eventually get to the point of saying, I don't care if I'm right and they're wrong. I don't care how much it's cost so far. I got to get out of this. I got to get it over with. So they take a nuisance settlement. They're gone, and the company gets away with it.
And I guess from what I experienced, and I know, we won't get too far down the road of, trust fund, things like that. You'll ultimately end up getting in trouble for. But I want people to understand that, the human connection involved in this type of work, right? The plaintiffs, the people that you're defending, and you're talking them through this process, and they're not paying you yet, but they have a case, and you're convincing them, hang in there. I know let's say you're not working, and then you hurt your back, and then you need this, and you need these things, and you're being weighted out by this corporation. It gets very, very expensive, and you're trying to find money to move around to pay for things to keep your cases going until you can get them settled.
Yeah, that's the story, and the more of it I did, the more of it came forward. I guess in the long run, I was kind of shocked that there was still that level of discrimination that we're faced with in this world today, because there was no end to it. And there was very few lawyers doing this type of work I was doing, so it was a small bar. We knew each other. We shared information together, but there was always way too much work for everybody involved.
Mm-hmm. And so now we'll move into the second. I feel like your story comes in waves, segments. We talk about the career, the building up, the what you do. Now we're going to move into the fact that the trust fund, using money from a trust fund to fund cases that people couldn't pay for. What can you say, or what do you want to say about that part of the story, about using trust fund money when you're not supposed to, or whatever?
Well, first of all, as a lawyer, you can never do that. And I didn't ever plan on having to do that. I just, a couple of points, got desperate, and the only way I could keep my doors open, pay the rent, pay my employees, to keep this thing going so I could get the money that was necessary to keep prosecuting these cases, was to what I called borrow money from my trust account. That was money that belonged to another client that I had won a case for, and I had in my trust account pending distribution. And I would, in a number of situations, just got so desperate, I quote, borrowed from them to pay somebody else who'd been waiting longer, and then I'd have to hurry to settle another case so I could pay that client that was on hold. Of course, they didn't know I was doing this, and when they pushed me on it, I had to lie to them about what I was doing with their money and when it would come, making up stories about delays and liens that had to be resolved. And then I'd get another settlement, and I could pay them, and they would be fine. But then it happened again. Every time it happened and I got it, people paid down, I was sure it wasn't going to happen again. And eventually the cost just exceeded anything I was going to be able to pay back. So, God, by that time I was drinking way too much. I'd started using opiate pills with the alcohol to just be able to even function. I was feeling so miserable about what I was doing. I finally just went to some lawyer friends of mine and said, this is what I did. Do the best you can for me. But I knew at that point that I would be going to jail over this.
And see, I tell people when they ask me, I'm like, it's the easiest case that the federal court ever prosecuted because you did all the work against yourself. You prosecuted yourself. You gave them all the records. You did, you gave them all the evidence they needed to, because when you'd hit that point, you were never going to contest guilt. You just were there to say, yeah, I messed up.
Yeah, I didn't hide anything. If once in a while, a bar association will do a random surprise audit on lawyers. If they'd ever done one on me, it would have taken them 30 seconds to figure out my trust account was way out of compliance, and I would have been in trouble then. But I wasn't trying to take anything from anybody. But in the end, when you take money and you don't pay it back, that's theft. Mm-hmm. You can try and make some excuses for it. You can try and put some kind of spin or twist on it, but in the end, it's a theft.
I mean, the experience, I remember flying back, and I remember how devastated you were, and that you're embarrassed, you're devastated, you were sad. And I remember us having a conversation, and this is, now 7 years ago? Maybe 7 years ago?
I blew the whistle on myself in 2010, the latter part of 2010, and we're in the mid part of 2017, so it's almost 7 years.
I remember having that conversation where I know it's almost like one that you had with me when I screwed up numerous times, when I blew it numerous times in high school, whether it was kicking in grandma's door to play ping pong in their garage when we were convinced we saw one spy movie and you could jimmy the lock with a credit card, or a library card for us because we didn't have any credit cards at 16. Totally splintered the doorway and then tried to piece it back together and then tried to lie to Mom and Uncle Dennis about it. I remember having the same conversation, but in a flip role where it was like, okay, we're here. We're starting at this point now. We can't change what happened, but all we can do is start taking positive steps to, get your case resolved, figure out what the next navigation is, the next move. I have a funny story about... And it's a funny story on a day that you probably has got to be one of the worst days of your life. But sentencing at the federal courthouse, which was, here's the funny story. I was waiting in the upstairs library with Mom at the sentencing hearing. And you were walking over with your attorneys. And all of a sudden, we heard outside, gunshots, right?
Oh, boy.
Gunshots on the street, and Mom is freaking out, and they locked the courthouse doors. I think you guys hadn't even left your attorney's offices yet, so it wouldn't matter. And Mom is like, what was that? And I'm like, I don't know. And I look on so I look on Twitter, and I search gunshots, federal courthouse. And sure enough, there was somebody tweeted already, like, oh, my God, some guy just got shot a block from the courthouse.
Oh, no.
And we started, I'm laughing, but I'm also like, we were in the middle of a panic, and Mom's like, so like, call their attorneys. Call the attorney. We call, and you're like, what? What are you guys talking about? We're fine. We're walking over. I just remember having this moment.
Thought I'd tried to break away, and some officer shot me.
You made a run for it,
escaping.
And we don't need to dwell too much on sentencing, because that was just, I'm sure that was an emotional situation for you, given that you're in front of a judge you probably know well.
I tried cases against him when he was a young prosecutor, and I was a young public defender.
I tried
cases representing defendants, and he was prosecuting them to put him in jail.
You guys were duking it out?
Oh, yeah. Hey, there's nothing better than a really good jury trial with two lawyers that are very competent.
Yeah, and hungry and young.
Right.
Putting in a lot of hours.
Yep. Leaving no stone unturned. So, I mean, that is a way we get to justice or get to the truth. The unfortunate part is that's a process that's extremely expensive and takes a very long time, like weeks of trial and hundreds of hours of preparation.
I mean,
that's the justice system, and it just doesn't work for people that don't have lots of resources.
Right. I mean, in your situation, it was probably the quickest guilty verdict, no contest.
Well, that's true.
I mean, the money cost for yours was you did all the work for yourself. So let's move it along to, because I wasn't there the first day. The first prison that you went to, and your sentence was what, 4 years?
4 years.
4 years. I wasn't there. Mom dropped you off. You were in Sheridan, Oregon.
Yeah. Sheridan,
Oregon. And I don't even know how to ask the question, but can you put yourself back, like the feelings, like I always think of it like, it's the only comparison I can come up with in terms of the nerves of two people is the first day you have to drop a child off for kindergarten, and you don't know what's going to happen there. You just got to leave and go away. Can you talk about that, how you felt about that, and then just that process of that first day and your feelings of any shock or things you didn't know you were going to encounter?
Oh, of course. And it was a shock for both of us. We had to drive down to Oregon, south of Portland, for the federal penitentiary I had turned myself into. That was a long drive, I'll tell you, when you're...
I mean, it's a pretty long drive without the circumstances.
Yeah, I was amazed that Joanne was up for doing it, but she was, and she did a great job of it. It was such a long drive that we had to spend the night at a hotel just outside of the city, McMinnville, actually it's at Sheridan McMinnville area. And we got up the next morning and drove out to the prison, and it's got two aspects to it. It's got a medium security level where there's, it's the brick walls and razor wire and the electricity towers. And guard towers, shotguns. And then there's a side to it that is barracks that are camps that I started out at. But when we drove up, all the in-processing goes through the main medium security, high security area of the penitentiary. We drove up and we got out of the car and started walking towards the front door, and all of a sudden 3 armed guards came up to us and escorted us back to our car and said, you stay in this car until we come back to get you. And at that point, a bus drove up, and 4 of those black FBI-style sedans drives up. Guards got out with their riot gear on and their shotguns, and the next thing we saw was the main doors open up and a dozen men in orange jumpsuits shackled together from shoulder to foot came waddling out, because you can hardly walk in those when you're cuffed with those chains around your legs, to get in to this van for transport. It was just absolutely shocking. We didn't know what to expect next. Honestly, it was
one of those moments where you're like, "There's no way I'm supposed to be here. There's no way. I know I'm guilty, but there's no way that I'm not gonna be with those people.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna be with those guys that are just shackled to each other. I don't need shackles. You can just tell me with a stern voice where I need to go, and I will go that place."
We looked at each other, and all we could do was hug each other. She had the ability and stamina to walk into the premises with me. So after I emptied my pockets of everything, and they were ready, filled out a few forms, and they were ready to escort me back to the solitary rooms. She left. It was a hard time. I got locked into a concrete room with nothing in it, just a light bulb, and you sit there and sit there. It seemed like 24 hours. It was probably only a couple of hours, but you get stripped down, you get hosed down, you squat and cough, get into clothes that don't fit, jumpsuits that don't fit, and everything you have is taken. You wind up getting a small little metal locker and one pair of underwear, socks, canvas shoes. And then you're escorted to a jail cell where you meet people you've never seen before, and some who are not stable and some who are very angry. And that's your new life.
Yeah, wow. And then how long, is that before you go to the barracks?
Yeah, I was
camp, or?
I was in that holding facility for a week before I went anywhere else. And at that point, you're mixed in with people of medium security and people with mental health problems and people with discrimination issues and violence issues. I didn't know what was going to happen. I thought I was heading for a camp, but they kept me there for a while.
Did you have, in those moments, what do you tell yourself? Because I'm sure this happened numerous times, but what do you tell yourself in those moments that just to not just, because it seems like you're coming from a background, you made a mistake, and now you're in a room with people who are varying in violence level, in background, in everything. What do you say to yourself to just not give up immediately? Because you didn't give up, and that's ultimately where this story ends, or it takes off or continues on.
Yeah. At that point, your survival instinct kicks in, and that's all you think about. You don't think about, why am I here? How did I get here? All you think about is, how am I going to stay alive in this environment? And how do I get through from one day to another? Everybody kind of wonders why it is that I wake up at 4 o'clock every morning. You can almost set your clock by it. It started the first night that I was in prison, and it's never changed since. I wake up at 4 a.m. on the alert. I need to take naps in the afternoon because you don't sleep well at night. The old adage of sleeping with one eye open is almost what you have to do. You never know what can happen to you at night. There's a lot of assaults that happen at night. There's a lot of thefts that happen at night. There's a lot of people with mental health problems that
don't sleep.
They don't sleep, right?
They just walk around.
They wander around, and sometimes just out of the blue they get angry and attack somebody for no reason. Whatever reason it is, you'll never understand it. So you're really on the alert. So that's what I was thinking in those early days.
And then when you got to the camp, I imagine things, because that's where I first visited you, and I imagine things, you make it through that holding cell area with all that, then you're sectioned off in more of a camp environment. But there's still, when I say camp, it's not like summer camp. It's not log houses and like a canoe and stuff like that. It's not Ernest Goes to Camp. It's still fenced off. There's fences and there's guards and there's rules and there's doors that are locked at times. And can you talk about your experience getting into that environment?
Yeah. We were in this particular location, we were assigned to buildings that had kind of half cells in them, meaning that there were concrete walls that were 3/4 of the way up, and there were bunks inside of them that would take anywhere from 4 to 8 men. Each bunk had a 2-foot by 4-foot metal cupboard for anything that you had. You had to put everything you had went into that particular locker. And you were in close quarters with individuals. If you had somebody in there that was unstable and they started losing it, you were within a couple of feet of them at all times. It was, though, a camp that let you apply for and find jobs and activities that you could do that'd be more constructive. So most people in that part were what they call programming, where they go to school, take classes, get involved in activities, some recreational activities, and you could get passes to go out to do that. But every hour you had to check back in. If anybody didn't check back in, they'd shut the whole place down and go searching for them. If anybody violated the rules, once in a while they'd find some contraband. People would try and get cell phones in for some crazy reason. And every time they would find contraband or cell phones, then they'd shut the place down and you'd just be stuck in your bunk for a day or 3. If they caught you with something, you'd go to the, quote, hole, which was solitary confinement. And that's really hard-nosed. I spent a couple of days in solitary confinement because they sent our whole cell unit in there because one guy had carved out something that looked like a knife, and they found it in his locker. Punished all of us because they felt we should have told on him when we didn't even know it was there.
Snitched on a guy who had a knife.
Yeah, not in prison.
That's statistically a great move.
Well, and see, they have this group punishment that they somehow keep holding on to that never, ever works. So people would either make pruno, which is alcohol you make out of fruit that you can get out of the cafeteria, or they'd somehow get some drugs smuggled in and then usually stash them in common areas like bathrooms, TV room, shower rooms, so that if the guards ever found them, they'd never know who it belonged to because it wasn't on them. And so if that happened and one person did it, they would make 100 guys pay for it by locking the place down or throwing as many as they could figure connected to it into the hole.
So in the hole, you just sit in a dark room and they just bring you food?
Yeah, you're by yourself in a dark room. Generally, there's no air conditioning, no heat, so if you live in a cold environment, it's cold, damp, and wet. If you live in a hot environment, it's sweltering. And when I was in Terminal Island, the hole there, that's in Long Beach, where it'd get up to 90s in part of the summer. Guys would take their water and just pour it on the concrete floor, strip down, and just lie in it. It was so hot you could hardly even suffer through it. In Sheridan, where I started out, it was usually cold and damp because that's up in Oregon, and at least in the winter months, it was really cold and damp, and you get sick in there.
Mm-hmm. So I remember going to Sheridan. Sheridan was the first place that I visited you at, and for people who've never been to a prison visit, it really depends on the facility. A lot of times, like Sheridan wasn't. It was metal detectors, and they had a system. Everyone came in, you stood behind the line. When they did counts, which they do even during visits, you got to stand behind the line. I remember I was there for a long time. I also remember like the hardest part about the entire thing was leaving because you and I hung out for like 3.5 hours. We bought a bunch of some food at the vending machines, and for like 3.5 hours, we weren't really talking about prison or anything like that. It was just whatever's going on. It was just a regular old conversation. It could have been a conversation we're having right now, minus the fact that I don't have to leave in 2 hours and you have to go another way. And I remember for me, that was the first point, I think, that you being in prison felt real to me, because I had moved away. I was living kind of in LA and back and forth to Seattle and stuff. So though every other experience, you know, the sentencing was hard for me, was hard to watch, was hard to see you in that vulnerable position because, you know, I know your heart is a good heart, and I know it's just hard to see that, but it was hard for you. But I think that the first time that I saw you and then had to leave, I was like, no, why does he have to stay there? This is ridiculous. You know, this is insane that you have to stay there. And that was the first moment that I realized, like, oh my gosh, this is serious. Because not serious, like, it just, for me, is like, that's when the impact hit me. And maybe it's because I was in a little bit of not a denial, but just kind of repressing it, where it was just emotions. Like, I remember just crying when I was driving, just like an idiot, just because it's the first time I was really, really sad, because I realized that I could leave and you couldn't, and that made me sad because it was the first time that I'd experienced that. Now, granted, I've seen you a million other times, and I never had that same. You kind of become immune to the process, but it just felt so. And I'm sure everyone goes through this. Even if you're, well, maybe not. If your family member's a murderer, you're probably like, nah, I'm glad he's here. But but you know what I mean. I don't know how was the experience for you when you every time someone visited and you had to go back in. Was there a moment of letdown, or was it inspirational? Did we help or hurt?
Well, there's a lot in what you just said, and I'll break it down. The easiest part is, yeah, it helped a lot. It's a lonely existence there. It's a frightening existence. There are a lot of men there that have nobody. There were men there that never had visits, never had anybody write to them, never had anybody to contact. And they were real depressed, lonely individuals. And so I was grateful to have any visits I could get. The feeling that you experienced was probably the same one I experienced when you went out the front door and I went back into the prison, and that is the true feeling of helplessness, that there's absolutely nothing you can do about something. And that is pretty foreign to me, and it's foreign to you because you've always been able to figure out how to solve a problem. It may not get solved in the best way or the way you want it to be solved, but you will take a problem and you'll find a way to get it solved, or you'll find a different direction to go. But you can always go somewhere. You can always do something. Mm-hmm. This is the one time in my life and the one time in your life where there is absolutely nothing you can do. And I think it's what motivated me the strongest to get into this and stay in this career development work I'm engaged in right now, trying to bring career development to the prisons and reentry programs, because the weekends should have been happy times. That's the time you get to make phone calls to relatives and friends. It's the time they get to come and visit and talk to you. And with almost all of them, me included, as the phone would hang up or you would walk out the front door and I would go back to my cell, you've got this empty, helpless feeling that there's nothing you can do. And then when you come back from the phone or a visit and find out that your mother's ill or your daughter or son have been involved in an accident and they need some help, that your family's being evicted because they don't have enough money to stay where they're at because you're not there to help, and you know that and you hear about your kids getting in trouble with the law and getting arrested or going to juvenile court, and you're serving a sentence and you've got quite a bit of time left to go, there's absolutely nothing that you can do. It's just a feeling of desperation. It makes you ill. And that's what would happen with men time after time after time. And I realized that they're sitting around here doing nothing but complaining about the system, complaining about how unfair life has been, and then talking about the only thing they know, which is how to make money on the street and how they'll do it better next time, or they'll avoid certain characters that ratted them off when they were on the street earlier. And that's not the kind of things they should be studying and working on. They're there. They've got them for years. They ought to be involved in some constructive education and training towards a career, so when they get out, they have something other than the streets to go back to. I'm sorry to get lost on that topic, but when you brought up what you were talking about and the feeling of helplessness came, all those memories of what happens at the end of a visit, what happens at the end of a phone call, bring home the reality of the backwardness of the system that we have.
Well, no, I think it's a perfect time to bring that up, because ultimately what's led you to what you're doing now, which is, you know, meeting with counties, you're speaking at conventions, you're meeting with whoever you can meet with to talk about it. That's where it was, you were at a crossroads where it was, you're experiencing this helplessness, and you can go one of two ways. You can either do what you can to serve your time, better yourself, and make sure this never happens again, or you can completely give up and just say, screw it, what do I care? I'll get out, I'm going to make money the best way I can, I'm just going to be part of the system, rotating door, whatever I got to do. Next time I just won't do this and they won't catch me. But that's where you were at a position where you could have, just kind of given up, because you don't want to feel that helplessness, because caring is what creates the helplessness, because if you didn't care, there'd be no helplessness. So that's where it developed. I remember, and I think it's frustrating that there should be more educational resources, or more realistic educational resources. I know there are resources available to you, but I remember talking with you initially, and it's, if you don't champion your own rehabilitation, nobody's going to do it. I mean, your counselor, whoever is your case manager at a prison is going to do only so much, but if you're not the one who's really pushing yourself, you're not going to make it, or you're not going to be successful when you get out. I remember you were telling me about was that where you took the horticulture classes?
Right.
And you were reading books that still reference the use of DDT.
Right.
In crop farming. I mean, you were doing it to get the educational credits for your prison report card, or whatever you call it, your credits, or I'm not sure. Programming. But really, you're reading a book from 1971 that's from Oregon State University's horticulture department.
Yeah, and the craziness of this it explains why the system does not turn out people that are capable of finding occupation or being qualified, be hired for anything. I was in the elite horticulture program that actually led to a certification that would allow you to finish off the last semester at the University of Oregon. And we were using their old books. And when I got to the section about weed control, and they were using DDT, and you looked at the material that you were being trained on, you realized that it was so out of date and so in error in many ways that any kind of a degree you got from there was useless. And in fact, that's the way it turned out. The program was designed originally that you'd get a certification from the university and you could get a good quality job from that. And as it turned out, no one ever got a certification because
you weren't qualified at that point. What you knew wasn't certifiable.
Right. So that was really disappointing. The other real disappointing thing about the education process that they provide in prisons that is misleading to the public is that they're a mishmash of simple college courses that don't fit towards any degree. So you literally, guys would leave prison with 90 college level credits, none of which would add up to a significant effort towards a degree. You'd have to start all over again in college once you got there.
And I'm not sure what there's a term for, I don't know if it's like systemic failure, or there's a term for what happens when somebody is misled to to engage in programs like that, where they have their hopes set on all this, and then they get to where they're supposed to go under like a false pretense, and the system smacks them in the face again and says sorry. And it's like this disconnect of, well, you just told somebody who spent the last 3 years really working hard to play by the rules of the system and to better themselves so they could not end up in the revolving door of the criminal justice system. And now you just took all of that optimism and you just stomped all over it, and they're going to walk right back out of here and engage in whatever they have to do now to survive, because on the hierarchy of needs, survival is you need money, place to stay, you need money, you need food, and then the higher up you go on the hierarchy of needs, the more of a like self-actualization I think is the top of it or whatever. But you're going to have to resort back to whatever you have to do to fulfill those baseline functions.
Right, and in fact, you've made it worse because they're bitter. But systemic failure is probably an accurate term. I don't believe that the system intentionally set out to mislead people and to put all this energy and all these resources into providing irrelevant college courses. I think they thought they were doing the right thing, but it gets so disjointed in the process, and it's designed by people who don't know what they're talking about. They don't coordinate with the programs at the universities or the community colleges that issue the degrees. They may coordinate with the registrar's office or get the books that fit within a certain category of certification. And so they think they're doing the right thing, but it turns out it was so poorly organized in the first place that it was destined to failure. And that's at the institutions with good programs,
with actual resources and inmates that are at lower levels of threats.
Right. Yeah.
Is that first prison in Sheridan? Is that when you started your own class that you wanted to teach on resume writing and career interviewing and for people navigating the system on the outside when they have a felony on their record, or was that later on?
That's where it got started. And to his credit, I'll tell you, most of the ideas that I have started with one corrections officer who was the head of the GED education department, a guy with an odd personality but a real big heart. I don't know how in the world he wound up being a federal guard. He started out in the Peace Corps and worked there for a number of years, and then when he got out, somehow he got into law enforcement and then found his way into the U.S. Marshal's office, and then became a guard and got into the education department of the guard, of being a guard. And he had a goal of making sure that everybody in that particular prison camp got a GED level, left there with a GED level education. And so with my background in education, and I had some teaching experience, I wound up working for him. And what got me started on this whole thing was the first young man that I worked with that got his GED, who was a very depressed individual. Once he got that GED, he perked up. He was from Texas. He didn't have family. He didn't have anything to look forward to. He'd been raised on the streets, and he used all kinds of different drugs, and he'd sold drugs, and he was doing time for drug violations. He really perked up. And so this boss of mine, who was the guard, said, okay, here's what we do, Peter. For individuals who show some promise and they pass their GED and they're going to get out within the next year, you find out where they're going to release to, and let's find a certification employment program for them at the closest community college or voc tech school you can find, and I'll give you the resources to look things up, and then I'll go online and get all the registrar information they need, and you can get them signed up for student aid through FAFSA. I learned all that from a guard in the prison, and it worked for this guy. And we wound up, he'd worked in the oil fields in Texas, and they have a great technician position of petroleum tech. He could get that within a year, the first level. There's 4 levels. He could get the first certification in a year. And so we helped him. That helped him get extra halfway house time so that he could go to the halfway house and go to school while he was in the halfway house to get this certification. And he left there on a cloud. He was so excited. And they never let us follow people to see whatever happened with him. But at that point, I realized this should be offered to everybody. And 75% of the men in that prison, any prison system, would take it if you offered it to them and you made it a part of their planning program. You started to talk about it earlier when you said, but you've got to start your rehabilitation early. Every prison you go into, when you have orientation, they all tell you the same line. You have to start planning your release from the first day you start serving your sentence, even if you're doing 10 years. You start your planning right now for your release. But they don't teach you how to do it. They don't tell you what to do. They don't give you a counselor that's helping you do that. Most of the time your counselor is working as a disciplinarian and not as somebody who's trying to help you figure out what your career is going to be.
Well, that's the difference. There's some guards who are into the rehabilitation process. They understand that's what they're there to keep you safe and facilitate your rehabilitation. And there's some guards that frankly think they're part of the punishment system.
Right.
They think that that's their job. You're in my prison now, and now I'm going to dole out whatever punishments I see fit to you in terms of the way I'm going to treat you and my attitudes.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the punishment attitude is the predominant one in all prisons. But this one officer, and he didn't do it for everybody, but when he saw somebody that showed they wanted it, he would go to bat for him, showed me the way to do this. And you asked if that was the start. It was the start. And there were some other college-educated inmates there that helped me to start develop this career development program we started. And I was only there for about 3 months doing this before I got moved.
Oh yeah, that was going to be the next phase of the story, is the transfer process, because that is not pleasant. Look, I know you're immersed in the story at this point. I get it, but I had to cut it somewhere. And 60 minutes in on a 2-hour conversation, right at the exact point at which my dad's about to be transferred from Oregon, is wild. It's wild. I have no other way to explain it except an emotional roller coaster that involved him leaving from Oregon to Oakland to Victorville to Long Beach. Then he gets out, lives with me in a studio apartment 8 feet from my bed. So that's all coming up next week in the second half of the Brian Moote Show. Flashback Friday about my father, the lawyer, the prison inmate, the social worker, and ultimately one of my heroes.
It's finally fall and the perfect time for a total beauty refresh at Macy's VIP sale. With an extra 15% off coupon for the skincare, fragrances, and makeup that rarely go on sale. New arrivals from MAC, Estee Lauder, and more make it fun to update your routine, add a new color palette, or just treat yourself. And with over 250 fragrances from Calvin Klein, Hugo Boss, and more, finding a new signature scent is easy. And the perks don't stop. Get benefits no matter how you pay with Macy's Star Rewards. Savings off regular and sale prices. Exclusions apply.